Hi everyone, my name is Myles Campbell and you're very welcome to this talk which is brought to you by the Irish Georgian Society in association with the Office of Public Works. I'm a curator for the Office of Public Works at Dublin Castle, and the title of our talk today, Vicereines of Ireland, Portraits of Forgotten Women, is taken from an exhibition I've curated at Dublin Castle, which is on display there currently for the summer months. Now, if you haven't had a chance to see it, well, I'm going to give you a wee sneak preview now. Here you can see some of the portraits on display. It features some really significant works by artists, including John Singer Sargent, Thomas Gainsborough, and indeed Ireland's own Sir John Lavery. And admission is free, and it's there until the 5th of September. So if you haven't yet had a chance to drop in, please do come and visit it. And just a wee plug now as well, I suppose, there is a book to accompany the exhibition. Here's the cover. This is published by Irish Academic Press in association with the Office of Public Works. It's available to purchase from the Irish Georgian Society bookshop, and you can also pick up a copy if you happen to drop into Dublin Castle to visit the exhibition, where it is also on sale. So before I begin talking about the women who are the subject of this exhibition, this book, and today's talk, I'd just like to say a big thank you to the Irish Georgian Society for the invitation to share the new research carried out for this project over several years. And this research was carried out at archives, both public and private, across Ireland and Britain, also in museum collections and in collaboration with partners on the two islands. And I'd like to just say a particular thank you to the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art for some research funding, which helped to support the primary research carried out for the project. So I've been looking at various types of documents, letters, diaries relating to the women that we're going to look at today. And consequently, much of what you're going to hear is quite new research, indeed brand new research. So I hope you'll find it interesting and enjoyable. At this point, I am going to disappear from your screen so that you've got a chance to appreciate fully the PowerPoint images that I'm going to show you. You'll hear me talking in the background. So off I go. So the exhibition, the book, and the talk then that we're here for today, they all focus on a group of relatively little known and hitherto under-researched women who occupied the role of Vicereine of Ireland. And I'll just give you an idea here of one of them. This is an Irish-born Vicereine of Ireland, Caroline Hobart, Countess of Buckinghamshire, painted here by Thomas Gainsborough. This is one of the portraits in the exhibition. And Caroline, though you can see there her surname is Hobart, her original surname, her maiden name was Connolly, and she was Caroline Connolly, a Kildare woman of Castletown House. So several of these women, it should be pointed out from the outset, were of Irish origin. Now, as with any little known or obscure subject, I think it's helpful just to begin with fundamental questions, and that's what we're going to do today. Who, what, when, where, and why. So our key questions really will be, who were the Vicereines? When were they here? Where were they based? Crucially, what did they do? And ultimately, we will ask ourselves the question at the end of this lecture, why should we remember them? Well, question one then, to kick us off, who were they? I think it's a mark perhaps of how obscure these women were, that even the term Vicereine itself is quite obscure. But this is a relatively easy question to answer. The Vicereine was the wife of the Viceroy, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He was the chief governor of the country before Irish independence. And he was also known down through the centuries, alternatively as the Justiciar and as the Lord Deputy. So as his wife then, the Vicereine was also known sometimes as the Vice Queen or the Lady Lieutenant. And in the 19th century, she was granted the honorific style, Her Excellency. So in this case here, someone like the Countess of Buckinghamshire would have been referred to when she was Vicereine here in Ireland as Her Excellency, the Countess of Buckinghamshire. So these women then usually accompanied their husbands from Britain, because the viceroys were almost invariably of British origin, British peers, and they came over for short or sometimes quite long stays as the chief governor of the country. So when were these women here? Our second question. Well, among the earliest references to a vicereine are mentions of several in the 14th century, including Marguerite de Clare, the wife of Piers de Gaveston, and she was said to have established herself in a state of great pomp in Dublin in the year 1308. A similarly regal regime was maintained by Matilda or Maud of Lancaster. She was said to have lived like a queen in the land of Ireland in the 1340s. Now, their presence in Ireland increases after the restoration of 1660, but really it's from 1767 that they're a permanent or semi-permanent fixture in Irish public life. In that year, compulsory residency was introduced for the viceroys of Ireland, and so their wives lived here permanently with them. So her presence then, the vicereine, was more or less guaranteed from 1767 up until 1922. And of course, we see the abolition of the viceroyalty and the development of the Irish Free State. Question 3 then is, where were these women based? Well, they were based primarily at 2 locations, the first of which was the Viceregal Lodge, which you can see here on the screen in Dublin's Phoenix Park. This is now Áras an Uachtaráin, the residence of Uachtaráin na hÉireann, the President of Ireland. This was really the summer residence of the Vicereine and her husband. But during the winter months, the couple were usually obliged to undertake a series of routine ceremonial duties. Levees and drawing rooms were held for the Irish ascendancy, and those took place at Dublin Castle. And here we can see the great courtyard of the castle, the upper castle yard, much as it still appears today, drawn here, illustrated here by James Moulton in 1792. A hive of activity, as you can see from this image. It was certainly that during the early months, the winter months of each year, when all of these various balls and ceremonial events took place, at which the Viceroy and Vicereine were obliged to preside. So that brings us to our fourth question. What did these women do? And this is a much more difficult question to answer. Now, as the wives of the Viceroys, they were the female faces of the British administration and the Crown in Ireland, and as such, they were automatically the fashionable figureheads of the social life of the viceregal court at Dublin Castle. And here is an image, a rare image and a really good image from the National Library of Ireland of one of the vicereines in action, as it were. Here you can see on the right-hand side the household staff at Dublin Castle assembled around the vicereine, Lady Aberdeen. She's seated there on a throne beside her husband, Lord Aberdeen, who is viceroy. And as you can see in the centre of the great hall there, St. Patrick's Hall, in the state apartments, we have debutantes being presented before the viceregal couple. So this gives you an idea of the kind of routine ceremonial duties, as I mentioned, that the vicereine was obliged to undertake. So looking at this image, you might think at face value that her role was similar to that of a royal consort. She's kind of like the queen to the king as the vicereine, as the wife then of the king's representative. But not so, according to one of these women herself. In 1801, the Countess of Hardwick, Elizabeth Countess of Hardwick, arrived in Dublin as the new vicereine, and very quickly she realised, to her disappointment, she became dismally aware of her status as something very much less than a royal consort, and indeed a very much lesser status than the status enjoyed by her husband. And this is a letter which is in Cambridgeshire archives, which she wrote back home to a family member describing the situation. She said, "On Sunday we went to the Castle Chapel." This is the Dublin Castle Chapel. "The Lord Lieutenant sits in a gallery by himself. He represents the king. But it would appear that I do not represent the Queen, as I am not worthy to sit on his left hand, but have a horrible dirty armchair in a side gallery." Now, I think the metaphor of the side gallery here is a really powerful and useful one for the position that these women occupied in Irish life and indeed now in Irish history. They operated certainly in an elevated position. They enjoyed an elevated status, sitting up in a gallery above the ordinary people. However, they operated at a remove. They were not in the central gallery, but they were in a side gallery. So I hope through this project and through our talk today, we will help to extricate them from this side gallery of history, as it were. So looking ahead then a little bit beyond this to a century later, we see that by the early 20th century, the role of the vicereine had actually become a really significant one. This is what one commentator tells us. It's quite long, but I'm going to read it out because I think it is quite significant. The position of the wife of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland has been one of increasing importance, and today she plays a part in public life almost equal to that of her husband. Success depends on her ability to realise the Irish point of view. That is more important than slavish adherence to points of viceregal etiquette. The great task of the vicereine is to make the castle popular. From it, deeds of beneficence must flow in ceaseless succession. The vicereine must be an indefatigable worker. Innumerable bazaars and balls and visits to hospitals, convents, colleges, schools, and national manufactories will fill in every crevice of time. The position of Vicereine of Ireland may be difficult and arduous enough, but it affords great possibility for interesting and benevolent work. Well, interesting and benevolent work is what we will be looking at today. That's what the vicereines, many of them certainly, did during their time in Ireland. So we might ask ourselves, before we look at this work, how did this improvement in the position of the vicereine come about? How did we go from a situation in the early 1800s where the vicereine was very much a lesser figure to one where by the early 20th century she was a figure almost equal, as we see here, to that of her husband? Well, it was not as a result, I must say straight away, of any changes to official policy or any efforts to delineate the parameters of the vicereine's role, but rather it was as a result of the individual efforts of the individual women who occupied that role and shaped it themselves over time. So as unelected, unappointed holders of an unofficial position, the vicereines of Ireland were largely left alone to define the role as they saw fit. Now, operating with only a fraction of the official support and guidance available to their husbands, whose duties, of course, were very much clearly defined, but without much of the restrictive bureaucratic oversight that often went with that support and guidance, they were often able to shape the role according to their own interests. So now we talk a little bit just about the methodology, I suppose, for how we're going to look at these women and how we're going to approach their work. It's really for this reason, and in the absence of any official series of papers pertaining to the role, that we turn to the private papers, the portraits, and the personal objects of these individual women to understand how they shaped the role of vicereine. And also in order to answer our question, what did they do? And also, why should they be remembered? Well, we start then, in order to try and answer that question, with this lady. This is Lady Mary Somerset, Duchess of Ormond, and she's painted here, as you can see, by Michael Dahl, portrait dating to the late 17th century. This is on loan to the exhibition from the National Trust at Petworth House in England. Now, Mary arrives in Ireland as vicereine in June 1703, and she's really quite a significant figure on the social scene already at that time. Mary is the daughter of the first Duke of Beaufort, and she's wife also of Ireland's only Duke, James Butler, 2nd Duke of Ormond. From 1702, she's also Lady of the Bedchamber to Queen Anne, which is quite a significant role. So when she comes here, she has a very fashionable image, and I think this portrait by Dahl really captures that image very successfully, an image that helped really to catapult her to what we might call today celebrity status. Now, up until this point, the situation in Ireland has been relatively unstable politically. Remember, we have the Revolution of 1688, then the Battle of the Boyne, where we see the end of the Catholic order, and the last Catholic vicereine, who is Frances, Duchess of Tyrconnell, the last Catholic vicereine for some time. And we see then the rise of the new Protestant ascendancy, the new order. And Mary then is one of the first women, when things settle down after the Boyne, to really start to engage publicly with the people of Ireland. As we will see, these women engaged in various spheres of activity over the centuries, such as charity work, healthcare, and also politics to a certain extent, but particularly the arts. And that's going to be really our main focus today. So how did Mary do this? Well, we have a contemporary account of exactly how it was done, and this is it. This commentator tells us that the Duchess made the welfare of the woolen manufacture and the weavers and stuff shops her greatest concern, insomuch that her Grace wore a new Irish stuff suit every Monday. So she appeared at court in Dublin Castle publicly every Monday wearing a suit of Irish clothes or an Irish dress. This was really a new departure, and weaving had kind of taken off in Ireland by this time with the arrival of the Huguenot weavers in Dublin in the 1680s and 1690s. So we really start to see this industry expand, and Mary then recognises the chance to use her fashionable image to adopt a paternalistic approach to the promotion of Irish fabrics, and she wears them and sets an example. And so we're told then that her example was emulated by all the nobility and gentry, so that no lady appeared at court in Dublin Castle in any other dress. So here we see this early effort by a vicereine to set an example, and it is apparently, according to this account, quite successful. But her early influence also extended to the field of charity. And on the 12th of October 1704, Mary laid the foundation stone for Ireland's first ever purpose-built, state-sponsored poorhouse. And here it is. So this building was on the site of the present-day St. James's Hospital. It is now long gone. So when Mary laid the foundation stone for this structure, this was far from a routine duty. This was actually the culmination of her personal campaign as Vicereine to raise funds needed to build this poorhouse. And in total, using her fashionable image and connections, she managed to raise the sum of £902 and 2 pence. And that's the equivalent of about €115,000 in today's money. So it's a substantial sum. Crucially, Mary also managed to secure an Act of Parliament allowing for this poorhouse to actually be erected. Again, quite an achievement for a woman in early 18th century Ireland. So these actions then set a template really for the vicereines who would follow in a more settled era in the 18th century. Now, as I say, this building is long gone, but the foundation stone that she laid for it does survive. And here it is, bearing her name, Mary Ormond, and the date 1704 when it was laid. This is on loan to us for the exhibition from Dublin City Council, and we're very grateful to them for this loan. It's a really fantastic, tangible indicator of all that she did to secure the future, the development and future of this building. So as the 18th century goes on, we see vicereines following this template, not always consciously. Some of them are certainly aware of the work that Mary did, but very often they do develop their own distinctive style when it comes to patronage and support for the poor and for Irish artisans. And they do tend to focus on different initiatives over time. One of the women who is particularly important when it comes to the arts is Mary, Martinez of Buckingham. Here she is, painted in a tiny little miniature, little watercolour on ivory by Horace Hone, and this dates to 1783. And Mary was just 23 years old in this portrait when she sat for it. Mary came to Dublin as vicereine in 1782, and she was there for less than a year into 1783. And this portrait was actually painted of her in Dublin as vicereine. So it's one of very few portraits we have of a woman painted as vicereine. Now, Mary was actually no stranger to Ireland, although, as I say, she came here from England as the wife of the Marquess of Buckingham in that year. She was actually herself of Irish origins. She was the daughter of an Irishman from Carlinston in County Westmeath, and she was also, very unusually by this stage, in the era of the Protestant ascendancy, a Catholic vicereine. Why is that important? Well, it did give Mary, I think, a particular insight into the perspectives of the Irish Catholic majority here, one that probably couldn't have been gained by other women at the time in the same way. So what did Mary do while she was here? Well, she first of all revised court protocols at Dublin Castle to make the wearing of Irish dress mandatory. She did this in January 1783 for a ball celebrating the birthday of Queen Charlotte. So up until now, as we saw with women like the Duchess of Ormond, these vicereines wore Irish textiles and Irish dress. They encouraged others to do the same. Mary is the first to actually insist upon this at court. She was visited in December 1782 by a deputation of weavers asking her to assist them. And from here on, this becomes quite a common occurrence. Weavers turning up at Dublin Castle asking the vicereine for help. And they petitioned her directly in person. And this was the response she gave them. I shall always be happy to give every encouragement and protection to the labour and to the produce of a kingdom with which I am connected by so many ties, and particularly to that important and valuable branch of commerce, the silk manufacture, which will always have my best wishes and support. So here we see Mary, she's Countess Temple at this point, later Martinez of Buckingham. Her title changes between her two stints as vicereine. Here we see her acknowledging her own Irish identity and how important that is, the connections that she mentions, connected to Ireland by so many ties, as she puts it. These connections are significant. So feeling that keen sense of responsibility as an Irish woman, and perhaps as a Catholic too, she pays the debts of over 60 struggling tradesmen in Dublin at this time. And this was really widely celebrated in the city. The Lord Mayor of Dublin staged a bonfire and illuminations to mark this. Mary paid their debts out of her own purse, and this enabled these struggling tradesmen to escape their creditors and then earn bread for their families, as it was put at the time. Mary also patronised Irish artists. Now, we saw the portrait there by Horace Hone, and she invites Hone from London to Dublin, and she sets his career up in the city, and he stays here thereafter. But she also does work to support other artists too. And finally, then, Mary takes an interest in the field of female healthcare. She's one of the first women to do this, and she supports the lying-in hospital, this, of course, known now today as the Rotunda Hospital. Here's Moulton's view of it from 1795. And there are a series of boards in the building. They remain there to this day, and they list the charitable donations made by influential figures to the hospital over the years. And if you look at the one for Mary's period here in the early 1780s as vicereine, you can see that her name heads the list as the largest donor, the largest fundraiser, and indeed it's the name really associated with the largest donations for many years thereafter. So her contributions are not eclipsed for some time, even by successive vicereines. So it's quite an important legacy that left behind by Mary, Countess Temple, later Marchioness of Buckingham. Now, quite a different figure, probably less shy and retiring than Mary, is Mary Isabella Manners, another Mary, 4th Duchess of Rutland. And she comes immediately after Mary, Countess Temple, Marchioness of Buckingham. She's here as vicereine from 1784 to 1787. Her husband's ancestral home is Belvoir Castle in Leicestershire, and I'd like to say a big thank you to the archivist there and the staff there and the team there, and indeed to the current Duke of Rutland for helping us to borrow this portrait for the exhibition and for giving us access to the archives. There's some fascinating material about Mary in those archives. I think this portrait of her really captures for me the stylish silhouette that made her the leader of Irish fashion in the 1780s. Now, she was mocked a little bit, and she was the subject of some contemporary cartoons for her very elaborate headgear. And you can see this headdress in the portrait is no exception. She was often depicted in cartoons with enormous headdresses with feathers sprouting from the top, such as the one seen here. Now, soon after she arrived in 1784, Mary publicly pledged very early on to set a powerful example through her dress as vicereine. So she quickly established a viceregal wardrobe of extraordinary richness, and she really was the biggest spender, certainly, of all of the vicereines on Irish fashions. Now, I've been looking at the bills, and it would make your eyes water, it has to be said, for her clothes in the Belvoir Castle archive records. And among the bills, just for an example, we see a suit of clothes richly embroidered with velvet gold spangles, chains of gold and beads, and 3 large feathers of exactly the kind seen here on her headdress. Now, you can just imagine the kind of look she must have created, the kind of impact she must have created when she strutted into the state apartments at Dublin Castle, you know, so resplendently dressed with such cutting edge fashions. The spangles mentioned in that account were the equivalent of today's sequins. So she's glittering from head to toe. She's very conscious, I think, of her fashionable image and its impact. And she's also infamous for hosting all-night parties at Dublin Castle. Again, a departure for the Vicereines, certainly at that time. The women of Dublin were said to be complaining of being exhausted, having to try and keep irregular hours with her. Sometimes she didn't go to bed at the castle till 7 o'clock in the morning. So all of this really helped to set a very powerful example. It was followed, it would appear, by the women of Dublin, and her patronage was just unprecedented in its lavishness. And so she did help to create what was described as a powerful impulse for Irish industry, described at that time. So in response to this, the weavers of Dublin were delighted, as you might imagine, and some of them awarded her the freedom of their guild. So the Guild of Shearmen and Dyers, which I think is a really fantastic medieval sounding guild name, they awarded her the freedom of their guild in December 1784 for her constant attention, as it was put, to their trade. And the freedom of their guild was presented to her in a gold box. Mary also, quite novel for the time, started to wear some of these Irish fabrics, not only at Dublin Castle, but at court in London. And in January 1785, she appeared at St. James's Palace at a royal levee, dressed in white Irish poplin, and it was picked up on by the newspapers at the time as being a very novel type of fabric. We'll hear more about Irish poplin a wee bit later on in the talk. So here she is trying to broaden the market for Irish fabrics by modelling them at court in London. Well, we move now to, I'm sorry, just before we do move, I should say this fountain, memorial fountain, you might be familiar with it at Merrion Square in Dublin. It commemorates her husband, but also it commemorates Mary. If you zoom in and have a look, you'll see there she is on a roundel. This fountain was completed in 1792, and this is the only example of a known woman, rather than a mythological or allegorical or religious figure of a woman, being represented on the Dublin streetscape in a monument in that period. So it's quite significant. It's one of the few examples of a known woman visible as part of the sculptural heritage of the city of Dublin in the 1780s. As I say, we move now, though, from the palmy days of the 1780s, when Ireland was enjoying legislative independence and the Rutlands were spending lavishly at Dublin Castle. We move then to the 19th century, and things, of course, change very dramatically. Here we see Elizabeth, Countess of Hardwick. She, I mentioned her earlier, she was the one who complained about being in the side gallery at the Castle Chapel. She is the first vicereine of the Union period. Now, the Act of Union bringing about the new United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland formally takes effect on the 1st of January 1801. And a little known fact, a side fact, I suppose, it's marked formally in Ireland by the hoisting of the Union flag from Bedford Tower at Dublin Castle. So at midday on the 1st of January, the flying of that flag marks this new departure for Ireland. Of course, now it means that Ireland has lost its parliament in College Green in Dublin, and Ireland's MPs are now sitting at Westminster. So with this exodus of Ireland's politicians, we naturally, inevitably see a decline in the economy of Dublin. But it's a decline that happens quite slowly over time. It's a mistake to think that the economy in Dublin simply collapsed in 1801. The Napoleonic Wars, for one thing, gave the country a good economic bounce for some time thereafter, but certainly it was the beginning of a decline. And as we know, it was a major decline. And by the 1840s, the tragedy of the Great Famine lays that bare so painfully for all to see. Now, as the first viceroy of this Union period, Elizabeth here senses the impact of this political change immediately when she arrives in Dublin. And this is what she says about the people of the city. I was much struck with the appearance of sickness and depression among them. This is on her first journey into Dublin from Kingstown, or Dunleary as it is now. And she says it will be a good thing to show the tradespeople that the Union does not do away with the court. So she senses that there is uncertainty about the future of the viceregal court. If Ireland is now, theoretically at least, an integral part of the United Kingdom, well, why is it being treated differently? Why does Ireland have a viceroy and vicereine when Scotland and Wales don't? So she's conscious that the existence of the viceregal court is in doubt, is up for consideration, is questionable, and she wants to show that it can have a continued relevance. And she wants to reassure the tradespeople, as she says here, that the Union hasn't destroyed the court as well as the Parliament. So she identifies really the need for new models of support that will not only help Irish artisans, but that would also enable them to help themselves. So a hand up rather than a hand out, if you like. Now, before this period, as we've seen briefly, support from the Vicereines had been largely paternalistic in nature, so quite top-down in nature. And although it was well-meaning, it was inevitably circumscribed by the buying power of the individual vicereine and her personal influence during her time in Ireland. And so it was therefore of really limited use, unless in the hands of prodigious spenders like Mary Isabella, Duchess of Rutland. So really, you know, it was all well and good when a vicereine was here in the 18th century. If she had lots of money, she was buying Irish fabric, she was encouraging other elite women to do likewise, and it was a temporary boost to the economy. But when she left, the wheel had to be reinvented next time, all over again. So the focus then with Elizabeth here now shifts to more sustainable, coordinated and structured initiatives aimed at empowering artisans long after the vicereine is gone. And so in 1805, Elizabeth establishes the Charitable Repository. Now this is an outlet based at 92 Grafton Street, and it's modelled on the Manchester Repository. And it was an early outlet for female industry. That's how it was described at the time. It was a place where women could sell Irish textiles. Now, Elizabeth left as vicereine in 1806, but we learn a lot about the enduring value of the Charitable Repository from one of her successors, Charlotte Florentia, Duchess of Northumberland. And visiting the Charitable Repository in 1829, so nearly 30 years later, this is what Charlotte tells us. I visited this day the Charitable Repository. All persons who, from reduced circumstances, are in distress, may sell the product of their industry without disclosing their names. I was told that the widow of an officer makes £300 a year in this manner, and the work shown to me was beautifully executed. I made some purchases. So what Elizabeth, Countess of Hardwick, has provided here is an outlet where a widow, as the example here highlights, or any woman can submit her work, her wares anonymously to this outlet and earn up to £300 a year. That's the equivalent in today's money of over €23,000. So what this actually means, if we think about it, is that a woman in pretty difficult circumstances, at a time when women had very few opportunities for paid work, certainly of any meaningful kind, can actually sustain herself almost independently through the Charitable Repository. That is a remarkable thing, I think, a remarkable legacy for Lady Hardwick to have left behind. And the Charitable Repository endures, I might add, for decades after in Grafton Street. So Before we move on from Lady Hardwick, this is also something that she is involved with. This is an illustration drawn by her from a play called The Court of Oberon. And this play was written by her, it was illustrated by her, as you see, and it was published then by her in 1830 in aid of the distressed Irish. That's how it was characterized. And this, of course, is long after she's here as Vicereine. She leaves in 1806, but this shows her continued concern for Ireland many, many years later. And this is a feature of certainly the patterns of behavior of some of these women. They do maintain a lifelong interest in the country even after they leave Dublin. We move now to one of the really very influential and important figures in our story in the 19th century. This is Charlotte Florentia Percy, the Duchess of Northumberland. And I've mentioned her diaries there already. Charlotte Florentia was here from 1829 to 1830 as Vicereine, and in her diaries, which are a remarkable resource, she gives us fantastic details into high life and low life and everyday life and everything in between in Dublin and in Ireland while she's here as Vicereine. Now, I had great difficulty tracking down Charlotte's diaries. They weren't among her family papers, and I assume that they just didn't exist. But just, I suppose, as a side note here, when talking about research into women's history, particularly elite women, we often find that the papers of these women do not remain with the family, do not go down the male line, but in fact, they go out of the family because they're left not to sons, but to daughters, as you might expect. And so the daughters marry into a different family, and so the papers go with them. So Charlotte's papers then found their way from Northumberland, where the family is based, all the way down to Flintshire Record Office in Wales, and that's where I tracked them down. And as I say, they're a fantastic resource. She talks, for instance, about visiting the Royal Dublin Society. She visits their sculpture gallery. She sees casts of things like the Laocoon, which are used for students to draw from and to learn to draw. She goes off to the Botanic Gardens. She's really interested in botany, and she tells us about what she sees at the Botanic Gardens. She describes the city of Dublin. So it's a really brilliant snapshot into the life of Dublin and its people, and also into some of its working poor in particular. It's really valuable information, I think. So in this portrait here, we can see Charlotte is painted by Martin Craig, an Irish artist. And we learn from Charlotte's diary how this commission came about. On the 9th of May, 1829, Charlotte tells us, quote, "We went to the private view of the exhibition of pictures." Now, this is the exhibition, the annual exhibition of the Royal Hibernian Academy, which had only recently been established at the time. She tells us that some of the portraits by Cregan really well executed, 2 or 3 landscapes good. So she's singling out Cregan for particular praise and attention. And so the commission for this portrait follows. She also tells us then later on in another diary entry that she had her last sitting for this picture on the 6th of December, 1830. That was her last day as Vicereine of Ireland. So her last act as Vicereine was to sit for the final sitting for this painting. Now, after it was completed at the start of 1831, when she had left Dublin, Cregan's portrait was displayed at the annual Royal Hibernian Academy, RHA, exhibition, but it did not attract favourable reviews. This is what was written about it. According to the Dublin Morning Register critic, it represents Her Grace, who is the very personification of an English lady, more like a Donnybrook Duchess or a lady's maid dressed up in the cast-off finery of her mistress. Well, that's quite a stinging criticism, isn't it? A Donnybrook Duchess. Well, Donnybrook, of course, was the location for the famous or infamous Donnybrook Fair, where all kinds of cavorting and debauchery is known to have taken place. So certainly quite out of sync with our view of contemporary Donnybrook maybe today. Being called a Donnybrook Duchess was not something to be very happy about back in 1831. I'm sure Cregan wasn't too pleased to read this review either. So the disagreeable tension then between the flashiness of Charlotte's robes and plumed hat here and the apparent graciousness and modesty of her character is what's being flagged up in this review. But I think it was a tension that Cregan was not unwarranted in highlighting. And I say this because we learn from Charlotte's diaries that she loved ostentatious displays. She certainly would have been pleased to see herself looking so grand and imposing, painted here as Vicereine, with these ermine robes, the pearls, and the very, very grand plumed hat. She tells us in her diary, for instance, that when she's hosting a drawing room reception at Dublin Castle, that she has left her gold plate on the table in order to arouse, quote, the satisfaction of the curious. And then a week later, she tells us that she's delighted with the brilliant effect, as she puts it, of her 2 services of plate, her dinnerware, which seemed to surprise as well as please. So she's aiming here not only to please her guests, but also to surprise them with the lavishness of her not 1, but 2 services of plate in the state apartments at Dublin Castle. She comments then a lot about fashion too, and she tells us that her guests at her first drawing room, the drawing room was the type of reception held for women and men at Dublin Castle. Of course, drawing room is also the name given to a main reception room in any grand house, but it also describes a ceremony held for women and men in a royal palace. So at her drawing room, her first one, she tells us that the guests were much better dressed than I expected. She clearly had very low expectations of the elite of Ireland. But when dress was incorrect or inadequate, she was also noting this. And she says on another occasion, unfortunately in this country, Ireland, they cannot comprehend that a fancy is not a masked ball. So she's saying that the Irish don't seem to understand that a fancy dress ball is not a masked ball. It's a costume ball, but not one where you should turn up incognito in disguise. She travels around to various show places. One of them is Carton House in County Kildare, but she's not impressed. And she tells us that that house is without any display. So you can see here she's got very high standards. She is a character who likes lavish displays and ostentation. However, I will temper that by saying that her diaries also record regular engagement with the poor and the disadvantaged. And she is very interested, it has to be said, in their circumstances, their welfare, and their living conditions. Now, in April 1829, for example, alone, in that month alone, she visited the Dorset Charitable Institution, the Charitable Repository, which we mentioned already, the Foundling Hospital, the Female Orphan School, and the Magdalen Asylum. She also had a deep affection for Ireland. She confesses this in her diary. And she was a passionate supporter of the arts. And Cregan's portrait also, I think, captures this more sympathetic, more sentimental side of her character. And I think it does so in 2 ways. First of all, we see the paint box and sketches there on the table beside her. This illustrates her interest in the arts and also her support, I think, from Cregan's perspective, for Irish artists like himself. Also then, I think her sympathy for Ireland, her sense of sadness at leaving the country is reflected in the posy of flowers that we see her holding in her right hand. At the center of them there, if you look, you can see a small blue flower. That is a forget-me-not. I've had to zoom right in to see what it was, but it's a forget-me-not, which of course symbolizes her impending departure from the country and her sadness at leaving. Now, she certainly did do a lot for the arts. Not only was Cregan one of the recipients of her support, but also artists like Henry Kirkhofer. And here is a portrait or a painting by him, a landscape, which Charlotte actually purchased as Vicereine. This is his coast scene with smugglers of 1829. This is one of the 2 or 3 landscapes that she said were particularly good, which I mentioned already, on that visit to the RHA exhibition in May 1829. This has long been part of our collection at Dublin Castle, but until now we haven't had a provenance for it. We didn't know where it came from. We now know, as part of the research for this project, that Charlotte purchased it, having seen it at the RHA, and that is how it made its way into our collection. So it's a really good and rare, tangible surviving indicator of a Vicereine's support for the arts in Ireland. Now, following on from Lady Hardwick's work, we talked about that more coordinated approach to charity. Charlotte set up the Irish Ladies Patriotic Association, and this was an association for the promotion and purchase of Irish textiles. And now, even though her husband was very much disliked by Daniel O'Connell and his supporters, When Charlotte set up this association, they acknowledged publicly that she was doing infinite good. So she departed Ireland in December 1830, and she said her final farewells. And this is what she tells us when she leaves Ireland. This is her entry in her diary. "We received those who called to take leave of us on our departure, and a most trying farewell it proved. I was informed a token of the regard of the ladies of our society was to be presented to me by the Duchess of Leinster. We leave a country where we have been so happy." And it was true. There was a token of regard presented to her to say goodbye, and this was it. An elaborate vase made by West & Son Jewellers of Capel Street in Dublin. This vase was commissioned by 65 women in and around Dublin, and it was forwarded to Charlotte in England. And we know this because it's accompanied in the archives by a testimonial and various documents supporting this. And as I say, it was accompanied by documents, one of which was a list of the women who had subscribed to it. But there was also a letter from them thanking her for what they called her deep interest in the welfare of the city of Dublin, her numerous charitable donations, and here we are, her liberal encouragement of Irish manufacturers. And I think you can see here that through its materials, its authorship, and its symbolism, it serves as a romantic expression, a very romantic and eclectic expression of the Irish skill and example in which Charlotte took such a deep interest. So we see here an Irish wolfhound in silver, Hibernia with her harp, and then above her a phoenix emerging from a canopy to herald national rebirth. We have Irish gold and silver, we have semi-precious stones, all of this sitting on a base of Irish bog oak. And around that, there is an inscription which says, "Hibernia grata," Ireland is grateful. Well, Charlotte's work, particularly in setting up the Irish Ladies Patriotic Association, really helped to sow the seeds for a revival of the Irish textile industry in the 1830s. But it would be another woman who would lead that revival. And this is really our penultimate woman of the day. This is Maria, Martinez of Normanby. And as I say, she was building then on Charlotte Florentia's work for the Irish textile industry. And she arrived here in Dublin in 1835, and she remained as Vicereine until 1839. Now, she's known by two names, the Countess of Mulgrave, and then later, while she's here, she becomes the Marchioness of Normanby. She's almost entirely forgotten. This woman just doesn't exist in the history books, which is really remarkable given, I think, how much, as you'll see, she did for Ireland while she was here. So I've been looking very closely at her papers, which are in her ancestral home in North Yorkshire. And I'm very grateful to the present Marquess and Marchioness of Normanby for access to see those papers, which have really helped to paint a very vivid picture of this remarkable woman. Well, what can we say of Maria, Marchioness of Normanby? Well, she was an enormously popular, I mean popular with, you know, the people of Ireland across the country, all the people of Ireland, not just the elite. She was a very humanitarian and very enterprising woman, and she worked extremely hard to expand and modernize the Irish weaving industry. How did she do it? Well, right from the start, she engages in the kind of activity we've seen already, buying Irish fabrics. So there's nothing new in that. This is what she tells us just a few days after arriving in Dublin in May 1835. "I hear I've lifted up the hearts of the people in the Liberties by ordering a poplin train and some poplin gowns, and I pray if you can get me commissions for poplins, do, as the more I can buy, the better for the poor people here. And I shall be only too glad to execute them. They are very pretty and in all colours, plain 2 shillings and 6pence to 3 shillings and 7pence, figured 5 shillings. I enclose you some patterns and pray recommend them." So she's writing here to her mother-in-law, Sophia, Dowager Countess of Mulgrave, asking her to get commissions for these Irish poplins. What are poplins? Well, poplin is a union of silk and wool. And according to one of the leading weavers of the time, Richard Atkinson, who was based on College Green, poplin had the advantage of being more durable than silk, but also relatively cheaper than whole silks. So it's really a cheaper version in many ways of silk. Now, of course, Maria quickly recognises the appeal of Poplin for the growing middle-class market, and she seeks to use her influence as Vicereine to elevate Poplin into the mainstream of Irish fashion. So she wants to make it not just a sort of a poor man's silk, but a really, really popular modern material. Now, before coming to Ireland, Maria had spent 2 years in Jamaica. Her husband was governor of Jamaica from 1832 until 1834. And her sketchbooks from Jamaica survive. Sadly, her sketchbooks from Ireland, which did exist, cannot be located, which is a real pity. I hope they will turn up. But in Jamaica, she's making drawings like this. This is a drawing of some flowers that she sees there. She's very interested in botany and very knowledgeable indeed about botany. And she really, from the word go in Dublin, puts these drawing skills into practice, and she begins to design her own floral poplin patterns. So she takes her ability to draw flowers and she channels that into the design of fabrics. So up until now, Vicereines have only worn Irish fabrics. They've never designed them. And of course, this is bound to have a major impact because the Vicereine, being the First Lady of Ireland, effectively, she is a figure whose influence is keenly felt, and anything that she is associated with, of course, will have prestige attached to it. So she recognises that this is an opportunity to marry her support for Irish weavers with her drawing skills. And very quickly she begins to do that. In only a month after she has arrived, she designs the Mulgrave summer tissue, named after her, which was woven up as a dress by Richard O'Reilly of College Green. So this is a type of fabric she designs, Mulgrave summer tissue, and Richard O'Reilly then weaves it as a dress, and that dress is then worn at court in London by the Duchess of Kent. And here she is. She is a royal princess, a member of the royal family, and she is the mother of the future Queen Victoria. So on the 25th of June, 1835, the Duchess of Kent wears this Mulgrave summer tissue dress made in Dublin at court in London. This is the first time we see a Vicereine getting a member of the royal family to wear Irish fabrics at court. Remember that the Duchess of Rutland herself wore Irish poplin very early on in 1785 at St James's Palace, but now we actually see Maria going one step further and getting a member of the royal family to actually wear it themselves. It's quite a new departure. Soon after this, she repeated the formula. She designed the Mulgrave brocaded poplin, and the first dress made from this fabric was again worn by the Duchess of Kent in December 1835. And here is either the Mulgrave brocaded poplin or a derivative of it, a sample surviving in the Victoria and Albert Museum. I was very excited when I found this. This, just to explain to you, is a brocaded poplin because the pattern, the figured pattern there, the flowers and leaves, is raised in relief from the white ground. So a brocaded poplin is one with a raised pattern, and it also then, a brocaded poplin is woven with gold or silver thread, and you can see here, I hope you can see it on the screen, the silver thread woven into this. Remember that Maria tells us that the brocaded poplins, the figured poplins, command higher prices, 5 shillings. So she's conscious that the weavers will get more money for their work when she's promoting brocaded poplins rather than plain ones. Those weavers she mentioned in the Liberties. So the sales of this poplin simply are unprecedented. That's the word that's used at the time, unprecedented. Everyone wants the Mulgrave brocaded poplin that the Vicereine has designed, and of course that a member of the royal family has worn in London. Now, Maria was very conscious of a lack of any official sustained support for the Irish textile industry, and this explains her relationship with the Duchess of Kent and why she developed that relationship with the Duchess of Kent. Now, as soon as Queen Victoria came to the throne in June 1837, Maria also set about securing her support for Irish textiles. Queen Victoria tells us in her diary that Lady Mulgrave, Maria, was very desirous to become a lady of the bedchamber, and her request was granted, and while serving as Vicereine, she went off to London to serve part-time as a lady of the bedchamber to the young Queen Victoria. Now, quite remarkably, within 4 days of arriving at court in London, Maria had personally persuaded the Queen to grant the first royal warrants for Irish poplin. I'll come back to that in just a second. This is what she tells us. She says, I have got 2 or 3 patents for poplin tradesmen from Lord Cunningham, the Lord Chamberlain, which he will send me to Dublin. A little bit of patronage, you see. I asked the Queen myself for Reynolds, Atkinson, and Mr. Sweeney. So here she is with Queen Victoria saying, oh, will you grant these royal warrants, the first ever royal warrants for Mr. Reynolds? That's William Reynolds, who we saw earlier. He wove the Mulgrave summer tissue. Atkinson, that's Richard Atkinson of College Green, who weaves the Mulgrave brocaded poplin. And Mr. Sweeney, I haven't been able to identify Mr. Sweeney. But she's working hard to build up these connections. Of course, this is widely reported in newspapers. Can we believe that this is all accurate? Well, absolutely, because there are letters from to and from Maria and the royal family about these matters. And we see one here, which she received from Victoria, Duchess of Kent, who we just mentioned, the Queen's mother. And this is what the Duchess of Kent said to her. I'm delighted to have an excuse to write to you, and I know I may trouble you with a commission, and particularly an Irish one. So she's saying, I know you'll be glad to receive an Irish commission from me, from a member of the royal family. She says, it is to desire 3 or 4 of those persons who sell poplins to send me over with their addresses some few of their newest patterns, which perhaps you'll be so good as to send me in a letter. So there's no doubt that Queen Victoria and her mother are buying into all of this. So as I say, Maria is very conscious of this lack of official support, and so she opens up this very significant channel directly to the monarch and her family. And this is the first regular, sustained arrangement of its kind for the patronage of Irish weavers by the British monarchy. It's a really significant development, I think. And it comes really out of Maria's sense of injustice, the injustice of British rule in Ireland. And here we see her with Queen Victoria. She's on the left of the Queen there, the figure to our left. Sorry, she's on the Queen's right. She's on our left. So she is here, as you can see, in 1838, still a very close attendant to the monarch, still using that influence for the benefit of Irish artisans. As I said, this is all born out of a sense of injustice, a sense of the injustices of British rule. And this comes out in a letter that she writes back to her husband, who's here in Dublin, from London when she's with the Queen. And she tells her husband that the British Prime Minister of the day, Lord Melbourne, has been abusing the Irish people in the presence of the Queen. It's a really remarkable record, and this is what she says. He began abusing the Irish nation yesterday. I told him how ungrateful I thought him, but he went off in his way, you know, perverse, artful, false and fickle people, never any good with them, true Celts. It provokes me, his fury before the Queen. It must prejudice her against a part of her own people that God knows have never received justice from any English sovereign before. And I think that's a very telling comment. It's a very clear indication that Maria is acutely aware of the deficiencies and the inequalities of British rule in Ireland. And this is really what's driving her attempts to help the weavers and artisans of the country. Now, Maria and her husband really believed very fervently in the need to integrate Ireland into the UK in a meaningful way. They felt that Ireland just hadn't enjoyed the benefits at all of its apparently equal status as a constituent part of the United Kingdom. So she brings over the president of the Board of Trade to Dublin to inspect the improvements that she's brought about in weaving at Atkinson's premises on College Green. She manages to market Irish poplins in London department stores. She gets orders from figures as influential as the Queen of the Belgians. She also goes on a tour of the whole country, but she spends a particularly long time in Ulster in the autumn of 1835. And she and her husband are very keen to reach out to Ireland's Catholic population. They feel strongly that the Catholics have been left out in the cold, and they want to try and make Catholic emancipation a lived reality as a result of that. So this does not go down well with many of the Orangemen that she encounters on her journey. She tells us in Derry, for instance, that she's met by violent Orangemen who are opposing her liberal gestures, her attempt to reach out to the Catholic majority. But she carries on nonetheless. She faces a similar demonstration in Monaghan, but the Catholic majority turn out in great numbers despite this to welcome her along with her husband. So this non-partisan approach is quite a novel departure in many ways. She also extends the hand of friendship to Daniel O'Connell. She's the first Vicereine, certainly, that I have a record of meeting and welcoming O'Connell at Dublin Castle, which is quite a significant development too. And she also helps to, this is her travelling box, which is in the exhibition, which she would have brought with her on these tours that I'm talking about. You can see all her accoutrements here on display. This is in the exhibition. She also redecorates Dublin Castle, really trying to elevate it and give it the status it's been kind of lacking, she feels, as a de facto royal palace. And she employs, of course, lots of Irish artisans doing this. Here is St. Patrick's Hall, the ballroom, following its redecoration by her in a new Italianate scheme, which is all documented in the papers. And this shows how it looked following this makeover. It was based on this staircase that she visited at Stafford House in London, now Lancaster House. You can see the similar sienna marbling effect there. And she also carried this out in her own home at Mulgrave Castle in North Yorkshire. So all of this is detailed in very great detail, this transformation of the castle in the chapter on her in the Vicereines of Ireland book that I mentioned at the start. So if you want to read more about it, that's where to go. So she had a really significant impact on the interiors of Dublin Castle, and very, very interesting history that is. So moving then to conclude in our talk today, this is just the drawing room as well at Dublin Castle, which she also redecorated and helped to design in 1838, and a portrait by her in the exhibition by the Queen's favourite painter, Sir George Hayter. And you can see her sitting for this portrait by Hayter. She didn't like Hayter, but she of course wanted to keep in with the Queen and to flatter her. So she sat to Hayter nonetheless, probably to make sure she kept on the Queen's good side and kept that link to the Irish artisans and that patronage going. We move now, as I say, to the closing stages of our talk. And we look here briefly at the Duchess of Marlborough, Frances Anne, Duchess of Marlborough. She's the woman you see on the right here at this table, sitting in a chair by the window. And she is one of the most impressive of the many women that we're profiling here. She pioneered a really extraordinary fundraising campaign in 1879. So we're moving now towards the end of the 19th century and to the abolition of the court in 1922. She was concerned about a deepening agricultural depression in Ireland, and she feared a repeat of the Great Famine at that time. So she launched an international campaign to raise money for those struggling with extreme poverty, particularly in the west of Ireland. And in just a few short months, Frances raised the equivalent of over 9.6 million euro in today's money. That is really an astonishing sum by any standard. And this is her, as you can see here, sitting at the head of the table as part of as the leader of her relief committee for the relief fund, deciding where these sums of money should be distributed across the country, from Donegal down to Cork in particular. 9.6 million euro is really a remarkable figure. And although she was a well-connected woman and a very influential woman, I think it is nonetheless a staggering achievement regardless. As a result of her efforts, she was presented with this diamond badge by Queen Victoria. This is the badge of the Order of Victoria and Albert, a very rare honour for a person outside of the royal family. And she was presented with this just after she finished up as Vicereine at Windsor Castle in 1880. And the Queen presented it to her, she said, for her indefatigable zeal as Vicereine. This woman will be probably the most familiar Vicereine of all to most Irish people. This is Isabella, Countess of Aberdeen, one of the last Vicereines. Housing, cottage industries, women's healthcare, these were just some of the many fields in which Isabel brought about improvements during her time as Vicereine. He was here on 2 occasions, in 1886 and again from 1905 to 1915. Now, Ishbel was a committed advocate of Home Rule, and it might be a surprise to some people that several Vicereines were actually supporters of Home Rule. Countess Spencer, an ancestor of Princess Diana, was another. And Ishbel really sought to shape a future in which the Irish people could both help and govern themselves. And so among her major initiatives was the establishment of Ireland's first dedicated TB hospitals at Peamount in County Dublin and Rossclare near Enniskillen in County Fermanagh. And she was known for having a very informal, approachable manner. And I think this rather sketchy depiction, rather impressionistic depiction of her just captures for me that informality. She's not a grand and remote figure in the way some of these other women were. However, the same cannot be said of our final Vicereine today, and this is where we end our talk. This is Viscountess Wimborne, the second last Vicereine of Ireland, who was here from 1915 to 1918. This is by Sir John Lavery. It's a wonderful portrait. It's a bravura display, I think, of his skill. I don't mind making that rather subjective comment. It's just a really impressive piece of work, particularly so when you think that Lavery painted this when he was in his 80s, which is quite an achievement, I think. It's painted a number of years, certainly after she was Vicereine. It's painted in 1939, but I think it certainly, for me, just captures the really striking, fashionable image that Alice projected during her time in Dublin. She was known at the time as Queen Alice. She loved and revelled in the pomp and circumstance of viceregal life. But by 1915, when she took up her role as Vicereine, this kind of pageantry that she so enjoyed was now looking increasingly outdated as Ireland drifted, of course, towards rebellion. And this is the final object in the exhibition. It's what we'll finish on today. This is a letter written by Alice to her mother, providing us with a first-hand account of the Easter Rising. It's written really then from her unique perspective as a woman who, as she put it herself, saw all from within the British administration during Easter week. And you can see what she says here. It's all calmed down now, but it's been a terrible time. One more awful tragedy in this beloved land. Well, unbeknownst to Alice, the very day that she wrote this letter at the Viceregal Lodge, the 2nd of May, that's when the first executions of the leaders of the rising would take place. And of course, the rest, as they say, is history. Alice could not have known that she, after a very, very long line of women over the centuries, going way back, as we said, to the 14th century, would be the second last Vicereine of Ireland. So finally then, why should we remember these women? Our final question. Well, from the outset, I think it must be said that not all of these women engaged in Irish life in a positive manner. Some barely engaged indeed with Irish perspectives at all. And just an example of that would be the fact that in 1849, at the height of the Great Famine, for instance, the Vicereine Lady Clarendon was continuing to hold her drawing rooms at Dublin Castle with apparently only minimal acknowledgement of the tragedy stalking the huts and cabins across Ireland beyond the castle gates. And it was noted by one of her guests who said there were many handsome and some shabby dresses, but it seemed odd to see so splendid a scene in a land of famine and misery. So, as I say, there is a dark side to this story. Not all of these women were people who I think responded as adequately and fully to the Irish situation as they might have done. However, as I think this talk has demonstrated, as I hope it's demonstrated, many of the women who served as Vicereine, whether motivated by personal and political self-interest, and I'm sure some of them were, or genuine altruism, and some of them also were, they touched the lives of the Irish people in ways that their husbands rarely did or rarely could. Through their actions, we are afforded glimpses into the life and work of Irish people whose lives, in some cases, are largely lost to history. Stories of these women also help us to appreciate the role of the Vicereine as an important and largely overlooked channel through which ambitious women could exercise power in Ireland. And again, there were few opportunities for a woman to participate in public life to this degree. And exercise that power they often did. Many made a real and tangible difference to the fortunes of the destitute, the sick, and the disadvantaged in Ireland. Many helped to bridge the religious divide by reaching out to the disenfranchised Catholic population. Many spoke up for and engaged closely with those who could not speak for themselves, orphans, struggling artisans, and women, and many did more than just one of these things. So the Vicereines of Ireland are surely then deserving of their place in Ireland's story, and they then now are deserving of the opportunity, I think, to emerge from that side gallery of history, and I hope you will agree. Well, if you want to see more, come to Dublin Castle. Here is our banner for the exhibition. As it points out to you there, admission is indeed free. It's there until the 5th of September, and we really hope you will come and enjoy it. So thank you very much indeed for tuning into the talk today. Thanks again to the Irish Georgian Society for the invitation to speak. Thank you to all the lenders to the exhibition, all of the people who facilitated the research, and thank you very much especially to my own colleagues in the Office of Public Works. So thank you all very much indeed. Gurda Míle Maith Agaibh, Go léir.